our hands around the discovery. The judge knows he's dealing with courtroom clowns. The judge knows that every federal prosecutor in the Eastern District of Virginia has refused to participate in this case. The judge knows all of the public information in this case. The judge knows that he's watching a legal Trump clown show in his courtroom. And although he dealt with it politely today.
Okay, so Donald Trump just got dragged.
Okay, so something absolutely massive just happened in federal court that has the entire legal and political establishment in full meltdown mode right now. We're talking about a courtroom incident involving Donald Trump that escalated so dramatically that judges had to take extraordinary measures, and the ramifications of what went down are sending shockwaves through the American judicial system, through the political landscape heading into 2026, and through every calculation about presidential power and accountability that we thought we understood. This isn't just another Trump court appearance that gets a few headlines and fades away. This is a fundamental breakdown of courtroom decorum involving a former and potentially future president. And it raises questions that go straight to the heart of how our institutions handle someone who has spent years pushing every boundary, testing every limit, and refusing to accept the basic rules that govern everyone else in this country. What happened in that courtroom represents a collision between Trump's approach to authority and the last institution in America that still has the power to enforce consequences. And what we're witnessing right now is that collision reaching a breaking point that nobody thought we'd actually see. Now, before we get into exactly what went down and why this matters so much more than it might look on the surface, let's be real about something for a second. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. They'll give you the dramatic video clip, they'll give you the surface level outrage, but they won't give you the full context of why this represents a constitutional crisis in the making and what it means for the separation of powers and the rule of law heading into one of the most consequential election cycles in American history. That's why we built Politic Insane to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. We bring the news straight to you every single day. Just hit the subscribe button below to join us. And if you want to support this work and be part of a community that truly cares about the truth, this is your moment. Subscribe and drop a comment below with your take on what's happening to our judicial system right now, because we want to hear what you think about this absolute chaos unfolding in real time. All right, let's get back to the video. Here's what happened. Donald Trump appeared in federal court for what was supposed to be a routine hearing in one of his ongoing legal battles. The specific case involving allegations that go to questions of obstruction, potential witness tampering, and violations of court orders that had been issued previously to limit what Trump could say publicly about the case, about witnesses, and about the judicial proceedings themselves. This wasn't a criminal trial in the traditional sense where a verdict was on the line that day, but it was a critical hearing where judges were considering whether Trump had violated the terms of a gag order, whether he had shown contempt for the court's authority, and whether additional sanctions or restrictions needed to be imposed to ensure that the judicial process could continue without intimidation of witnesses, without jury pool contamination, and without the kind of public pressure campaign that Trump has perfected over years of legal battles. The courtroom was packed with reporters, with legal observers, with Trump's legal team, which has grown increasingly frustrated with his refusal to follow their advice about courtroom behavior, and with prosecutors who came prepared with evidence of multiple instances where Trump had allegedly violated court orders through his social media posts, through his rally speeches, and through his public statements that seemed designed to push right up to the line of what the court had forbidden and then deliberately step over it. What started as a tense but manageable hearing quickly spiraled when the presiding judge, a federal jurist with decades of experience who had been appointed during a previous administration and who had a reputation for running an extremely tight courtroom, began walking through the evidence that Trump had repeatedly violated the gag order that had been carefully crafted to balance Trump's First Amendment rights with the court's obligation to protect the integrity of the proceedings. The judge laid out instance after instance where Trump had posted on social media about witnesses by name, where he had made statements that could be interpreted as threatening or intimidating, where he had attacked the credibility of the judicial process itself in ways that seemed calculated to undermine public confidence in whatever verdict might eventually emerge. Trump, sitting at the defense table, grew visibly agitated as this recitation continued. His lawyers tried to interject with procedural objections, tried to argue that the judge was mischaracterizing protected political speech, tried to suggest that Trump's statements were merely expressing opinions about a case he believed was politically motivated. But the judge was methodical, going through each violation with timestamps, with screenshots, with the exact language of the previous court orders, and with legal precedents showing that even public figures, even political candidates, even former presidents do not have unlimited rights to speak about ongoing legal proceedings in ways that threaten the administration of justice. And this is where things start to unravel. Trump, apparently unable to contain himself as the judge continued this detailed breakdown of his violations, began speaking out in the courtroom. Not through his lawyers, not through the proper channels of courtroom procedure, but directly interrupting the judge with statements that court observers described as combative, as dismissive of the court's authority, and as escalating in both volume and intensity. The judge, maintaining the composure that comes with decades on the bench, instructed Trump to remain silent and to allow his attorneys to speak for him, which is the basic rule of courtroom procedure that applies to every defendant in every case. Trump, according to multiple reports from people who were in the room, refused. He continued speaking, began making statements about the case, about the judge's alleged bias, about the political nature of the prosecution, about his belief that he was being targeted for his political views and his potential candidacy. His lawyers stood, tried physically to calm him, tried to whisper urgently that he needed to stop talking immediately before he made the situation catastrophically worse. But Trump, in what legal analysts are describing as one of the most extraordinary breakdowns of courtroom decorum in modern American legal history, kept going. The judge, faced with a defendant who was not only violating the gag order in real time by making statements about the case, but who was also disrupting the hearing itself and refusing direct orders from the bench to remain silent, made a decision that judges are empowered to make, but that happens so rarely that many lawyers go their entire careers without seeing it. The judge held Trump in contempt of court on the spot, imposed immediate sanctions, and when Trump continued speaking, when he continued refusing to comply with direct judicial orders to be quiet and to follow courtroom procedure, the judge instructed court security officers to remove Trump from the courtroom. What happened next, according to everyone who witnessed it, was surreal. Security officers approached Trump at the defense table, his lawyers, now in a state of barely controlled panic, because they understood that what was happening was going to dominate every news cycle and potentially prejudice every future proceeding, try to convince Trump to leave voluntarily to avoid the spectacle of being physically escorted out. But Trump, whether out of genuine belief that he should not have to follow the judge's orders, or out of a calculated decision that the optics of being removed would serve his political narrative of persecution, refused to leave. Court security, following the judge's direct order and with the judge temporarily pausing the hearing because it could not continue with this level of disruption, physically escorted Donald Trump out of the courtroom. Not in handcuffs. That's important to note because this wasn't an arrest in the criminal sense, but escorted in the sense that security officers took him by the arms and guided him toward the exit while he continued speaking, continued protesting, continued making statements that were being recorded by the court reporter and that will now become part of the permanent legal record. The image of a former president of the United States being physically removed from a federal courtroom by court, security is something that nobody thought we would see, something that has no precedent in American history, something that represents either the ultimate accountability moment, where even the most powerful figures must submit to judicial authority, or the ultimate proof, depending on your perspective, that the legal system is being weaponized against political opponents. The reaction in the courtroom was described as stunned silence, followed by chaos, with reporters rushing to file updates, with Trump's legal team requesting an immediate recess to confer with their client and to try to figure out how to prevent the situation from deteriorating further, and with prosecutors sitting at their table looking equally shocked because while they had been arguing that Trump was violating court orders, even they didn't expect it to escalate to the point of physical removal during the hearing itself. But it gets worse, or more significant, depending on how you look at what this means for the trajectory of Trump's legal battles and for the broader question of how the American legal system handles someone who has made defiance of institutional authority into a central part of his political identity. After Trump was removed from the courtroom, the judge reconvened the hearing without him present. Under courtroom procedure, a defendant can waive their right to be present at certain types of hearings through their behavior, essentially forfeiting their presence by making it impossible for the hearing to continue with them in the room. The judge proceeded to rule on the contempt charges, impose substantial fines that legal experts say could reach into the tens of thousands of dollars, and more significantly, imposed additional restrictions on Trump's ability to speak about the case going forward, including the possibility of pretrial detention if he continues to violate court orders. That last part, the mention of potential detention, is what has legal analysts and political observers in absolute meltdown mode right now, because it means that a federal judge has put Donald Trump on notice that if he continues down this path of defying court orders, of disrupting proceedings, of refusing to accept the authority of the judicial branch, he could face jail time before the judge reconvened the hearing without him present. Under courtroom procedure, a defendant can waive their right to be present at certain types of hearings through their behavior, essentially forfeiting their presence by making it impossible for the hearing to continue with them in the room. The judge proceeded to rule on the contempt charges, impose substantial fines that legal experts say could reach into the tens of thousands of dollars, and more significantly, imposed additional restrictions on Trump's ability to speak about the case going forward, including the possibility of pre-trial detention if he continues to violate court orders. That last part, the mention of potential detention, is what has legal analysts and political observers in absolute meltdown mode right now, because it means that a federal judge has put Donald Trump on notice that if he continues down this path of defying court orders, of disrupting proceedings, of refusing to accept the authority of the judicial branch, he could face jail time before any trial even begins, not as punishment for the underlying charges, but as a response to contempt of court and as a measure to ensure that the judicial process can move forward without the kind of obstruction and intimidation that the court found Trump was engaging in. Trump's legal team, emerging from the courthouse after the hearing concluded without their client present, faced a media scrum and attempted to frame what happened as an overreach by a biased judge, as a violation of Trump's First Amendment rights, as proof that the legal system is being used as a political weapon against someone who represents a threat to the establishment. They announced plans to appeal the contempt ruling, to challenge the additional gag order restrictions, and to argue that the judge's decision to remove Trump from the courtroom and to continue the hearing without him present violated his due process rights and his right to confront the accusations against him. Legal experts are divided on whether those appeals have any realistic chance of success, with some arguing that judges have broad discretion to maintain order in their courtrooms and that Trump's behavior crossed every line that would justify removal, while others suggest that the optics and the unprecedented nature of removing a former president could give appellate courts pause and could lead to some modification of the judge's orders, even if the core finding of contempt is upheld. Now, here's where this becomes a lot bigger than just one dramatic courtroom incident, bigger than just Trump's specific legal troubles, and starts touching on fundamental questions about American institutions, about political power, about the rule of law, and about what happens when someone with a massive political following decides that the normal rules don't apply to them. Okay, let's break down what this actually means, because there are multiple layers here that all matter and that all connect to the broader crisis of American democracy and institutional legitimacy that we're living through right now. First, understand that what happened in that courtroom represents the collision of two completely incompatible worldviews about authority and about how our system is supposed to function. The judicial system, at least in theory and in the way it's been practiced for the entire history of the American Republic, operates on the principle that everyone, regardless of their wealth, their power, their political position, or their public support, must submit to the authority of the courts when they become a party to a legal proceeding. This isn't a revolutionary idea, it's basic rule of law stuff. The idea that there's a set of neutral rules and neutral arbiters who apply those rules without regard to who you are or what your poll numbers look like. Courts have the power to issue orders, to set boundaries on behavior during legal proceedings, to sanction people who violate those orders, and ultimately to enforce compliance through the contempt power, which can include fines, restrictions, and even incarceration. This power isn't unlimited. There are appeal processes, there are constitutional protections, there are checks and balances. But within the courtroom itself, the judge has authority that is meant to be unquestionable in the moment. You can appeal later, you can argue later that the judge was wrong, but in the moment you comply. Trump's approach, which has been consistent across his business career, his presidency, and now his post-presidency legal battles, is fundamentally different. It's an approach that says that authority is something you accept only when it serves your interests, that rules are negotiable based on your power and your ability to rally support, that compliance is something you offer when it's strategically advantageous, and that you withhold when defiance serves your purposes better. This isn't just about Trump being difficult or Trump having a big ego. Although both of those things are certainly true, this is about a systematic rejection of the idea that there are institutions whose authority you must respect even when you disagree with their decisions, even when you think they're being unfair, even when you believe they're politically motivated. Trump has spent years testing this proposition, pushing boundaries during his presidency with executive orders that courts struck down, ignoring congressional subpoenas, refusing to comply with oversight, and discovering that as long as you maintain political support, as long as you can frame every conflict as you versus a corrupt establishment, you can survive challenges that would destroy anyone else. The question that's being tested in real time right now in this courtroom and in all his legal battles is whether that approach has any limits, whether there's any institution left that can enforce consequences when someone simply refuses to accept its authority. Second, consider what this means for Trump's political strategy heading into 2026 and beyond. Because this isn't happening in a vacuum. This is happening as Trump is actively campaigning, actively building support for another presidential run, actively fundraising off his legal troubles by framing them as persecution. The image of Trump being physically removed from a courtroom plays into that narrative perfectly, at least for his base. It's visual proof in their framing that the system is so threatened by Trump, so desperate to stop him, that it will resort to physically silencing him, to removing him from a courtroom when he tries to defend himself, to treating a former president like a common criminal. Trump's team was already sending fundraising emails within hours of the incident, with subject lines about judicial overreach, about political persecution, about the establishment's fear of Trump's return to power. The incident will be featured in campaign ads and rally speeches, in the entire narrative infrastructure that Trump has built around the idea that every legal challenge is proof of his importance and proof that he's fighting for people who are also being oppressed by a rigged system. For Trump's most committed supporters, what happened in that courtroom doesn't undermine him. It validates everything they believe about why he's necessary and why the system needs to be torn down. But here's the problem, and this is where Trump's legal team is genuinely worried, even if Trump himself seems to think he can turn any setback into political gold. This incident gives judges in this case, and in all his other cases, a very clear, very well-documented example of Trump refusing to follow court orders, of Trump disrupting judicial proceedings, of Trump treating the legal system with contempt in the most literal sense. Every future hearing, every future motion, every future decision about Trump's behavior and about what restrictions are necessary to ensure fair proceedings will now be made in the context of a federal judge having to physically remove him from a courtroom because he wouldn't stop talking. That's not a narrative problem, that's a legal problem. It makes it much easier for judges to impose strict gag orders, to impose significant fines, to impose the threat of detention, because Trump has demonstrated beyond any doubt that he will not voluntarily comply with less severe measures. His lawyers have been trying for months to argue that Trump can be trusted to follow reasonable restrictions, that he understands the seriousness of the legal system, that he just needs some flexibility to defend himself politically while still respecting the judicial process. That argument is now impossible to make with a straight face after a judge had to order his removal from the courtroom for refusing to stop violating a gag order in real time. Third, think about what this does to the institutional fabric that holds American democracy together. And this is where we need to zoom out from Trump specifically and look at the precedent being set and the norms being shattered. The American system has always depended on a certain level of institutional deference, a certain acceptance that while you can disagree with courts, with Congress, with the executive branch, with whatever institution you're dealing with, you still respect their authority to function and to make decisions within their domain. This deference has been eroding for years, accelerated massively by Trump, but not caused entirely by him. It's part of a broader trend of polarization and institutional distrust. But what happened in that courtroom represents a complete breakdown of deference, a former president physically refusing to accept the authority of a federal judge in the judge's own courtroom. If that becomes normal, if that becomes acceptable within a significant portion of the political spectrum, then what happens to the entire system of checks and balances that's supposed to prevent authoritarianism and prevent the concentration of power? The framers of the Constitution designed a system where different branches would jealously guard their own power and would push back against overreach by other branches, but they had to assume that everyone involved would ultimately accept the legitimacy of the other branches and would accept that sometimes you lose a conflict and you have to comply, even while you're appealing or working to change the rules through proper channels. If we're entering an era where major political figures can simply refuse to comply with court orders, can disrupt judicial proceedings without facing effective consequences, can frame any attempt at enforcement as political persecution and rally enough support to make enforcement politically costly, then the entire system of judicial review, of legal accountability, of rule of law becomes meaningless. You end up with a system where power is the only thing that matters, where compliance is voluntary based on political calculation, where institutions only have authority over people who choose to grant them authority. That's not democracy, that's not republic, that's not rule of law, that's something much closer to authoritarianism, even if it comes wrapped in populist language about fighting the establishment. Fourth, consider the international implications of images of an American president, former president, being physically removed from a courtroom, and this matters more than it might seem at first glance. America's credibility around the world, America's ability to lecture other countries about democracy and rule of law and institutional integrity, America's soft power that allows us to lead alliances and to shape international norms, all of that rests on the perception that America practices what it preaches. When we criticize Russia for show trials, when we criticize China for judicial systems that serve party interests, when we criticize authoritarian regimes for leaders who place themselves above the law, the implicit argument is that America is different, that we have a system where even the most powerful face accountability, where courts are independent, where rule of law means something. Video of Trump being escorted out of a courtroom undermines that narrative in complicated ways. On one hand, it could be seen as proof that American courts do enforce accountability, that judges will stand up to powerful figures, that the system works. On the other hand, it can be seen as proof that America is in political chaos, that our institutions are breaking down, that we can't even conduct basic legal proceedings without dramatic confrontations that look like they belong in a failing state rather than in the world's leading democracy. Allies are watching this and wondering whether America is stable enough to be a reliable partner, whether commitments made by one administration will hold if that administration is replaced by someone who doesn't respect institutional continuity, whether the rule of law means anything if major political figures can simply refuse to comply and face no effective consequences beyond fines that their supporters will pay through donations. Adversaries are watching and seeing weakness, seeing division, seeing opportunities to exploit the fact that America is consuming its institutional capital through internal conflicts and is less able to project power or moral authority internationally. The damage to American credibility doesn't happen all at once. It's cumulative, but every incident like this takes another chunk out of the reservoir of respect and trust that took generations to build and that can't be easily rebuilt once it's gone. Fifth, think about where this goes from here legally and procedurally, because the contempt ruling and the additional gag order restrictions and the threat of detention aren't the end of the story. They're barely the beginning. Trump will appeal, and those appeals will work their way through the system, potentially reaching higher courts, potentially reaching the Supreme Court, potentially creating major precedents about the limits of gag orders, about the contempt power, about how courts can handle high-profile defendants who use their platform to attack the judicial process. Every step of those appeals will be its own news cycle, its own political battle, its own opportunity for Trump to fundraise and to rally support and to frame himself as a victim. Meanwhile, the underlying case continues and Trump still has to appear at future hearings, future proceedings, potentially a trial, and every one of those appearances now happens in the shadow of what occurred when a judge ordered his removal. Will Trump modify his behavior? Will he continue to push boundaries? Will judges impose even stricter restrictions preemptively to avoid another confrontation? Will Trump's lawyers, who are reportedly furious about how their client's behavior is making their jobs impossible, continue to represent him? Or will we see the kind of lawyer exodus that happens when defendants become unmanageable and start creating ethical problems for their own legal team? There's also the question of what happens in Trump's other cases, because this incident didn't happen in isolation. He has multiple ongoing legal battles in multiple jurisdictions, and judges in those other cases are going to look at what happened here and are going to adjust their own approach accordingly. If you're a judge overseeing a Trump case and you see that another judge had to order Trump's removal from the courtroom, you're going to be much more inclined to impose strict gag orders from the start, to make clear that violations will result in immediate and severe sanctions, to take every possible precaution to ensure that your proceedings don't descend into the same kind of chaos. That means Trump's legal battles across the board just got harder, the space for his lawyers to negotiate accommodations just got narrower, and the likelihood of serious consequences for violations just got much higher. Sixth, zoom back to the political level and think about what this does to Trump's position within the Republican Party and within the broader conservative movement, because this isn't a simple story of Trump getting more popular every time he's attacked. Yes, there's a core base that will support him no matter what, that will see any legal action against him as proof of persecution, and will donate and volunteer and show up to rallies with even more enthusiasm. But there's also a significant portion of the Republican coalition, the suburban voters, the moderate conservatives, the business Republicans, the national security Republicans who are exhausted by the chaos, who are worried about electability, who are looking for an off-ramp from the Trump era, even if they agree with many of his policies. Images of Trump being physically removed from a courtroom, combined with the mounting legal troubles, combined with the constant drama, give those Republicans permission to move on, to support other candidates, to argue that Trump's time has passed and that the party needs someone who can advance conservative policies without the constant institutional confrontations and legal battles. You're already seeing careful positioning by other Republican figures, people who don't want to openly break with Trump while he still has massive support among the base, but who are trying to create some distance, trying to build their own brands as more stable alternatives, trying to prepare for a scenario where Trump's legal troubles or his behavioral issues finally become too much and the party needs to move forward. This courtroom incident makes that positioning easier, makes it possible to say that you respect Trump's policies and his fight against the establishment, but that the party needs a candidate who can actually govern without being consumed by legal battles and institutional confrontations. Whether that translates into an actual challenge to Trump in a primary, whether it opens space for other candidates to gain traction, whether it matters at all given Trump's demonstrated ability to survive controversies that would destroy anyone else, all of that remains to be seen. But the incident is now part of the narrative, part of the case that will be made by Republicans who want to move beyond Trump, and it's a pretty powerful visual for making that case even to voters who are generally sympathetic to Trump's message. Seventh, consider the implications for judicial independence and for the broader conservative legal movement that has spent decades building toward a Supreme Court and a federal judiciary that would be more conservative, more originalist, more skeptical of federal power, and more protective of individual rights and religious liberty. Many of the judges handling Trump's cases are conservative judges, some appointed by Trump himself, and they're facing an impossible situation where enforcing the law and maintaining courtroom order puts them at odds with someone who has massive support among the conservative base and who will absolutely attack them publicly if they rule against him. This creates pressure on judges to factor in political considerations, to worry about their own reputation within the conservative movement, to hesitate before imposing consequences even when the law clearly supports it. Some judges will resist that pressure, will rule based on law and precedent regardless of political fallout, like the judge in this case who ordered Trump removed rather than allowing the hearing to become a circus. But other judges might be more cautious, might give Trump more leeway than they would give another defendant, might avoid confrontations because they don't want to become the next target of Trump's attacks and of the backlash from his supporters. This puts the entire conservative legal project at risk because if conservative judges can be pressured or intimidated into making decisions based on political considerations rather than legal analysis, then the whole argument that conservatives make about judicial philosophy, about neutral interpretation of the Constitution and statutes, about courts that follow the law rather than imposing policy preferences becomes hollow. It turns judges into political actors who rule based on what's advantageous for their coalition rather than what the law requires, which is exactly what conservatives have been accusing liberal judges of doing for decades. The fact that Trump is willing to attack conservative judges, to undermine judicial independence, to treat the courts as just another political arena where you win by accumulating power and support rather than by making legal arguments represents a threat to the entire structure of conservative legal thought. You can't have a functioning legal system where judges are independent and where rule of law means something if major political figures within your coalition treat those principles as obstacles to be overcome rather than as foundations to be protected. Now, let's talk about the media coverage and the narrative wars that are already underway around this incident, because how this story gets told and understood matters almost as much as what actually happened. Mainstream media outlets are leading with the drama, with the unprecedented nature of Trump being removed from a courtroom with video and images that will be played on loop for days. Progressive outlets are framing this as proof that Trump is out of control, as vindication for everyone who has been saying that he poses a unique threat to institutions, as evidence that the justice system is finally holding him accountable in meaningful ways. Conservative media is split, with some outlets acknowledging the seriousness of what happened and suggesting that Trump needs to show more discipline, while others are going all in on the persecution narrative, framing the judge as a tyrant, framing the removal as politically motivated, framing the entire incident as proof that the establishment will stop at nothing to silence Trump and to prevent him from returning to power. Social media is amplifying the most extreme versions of both narratives, with the left celebrating Trump's humiliation and the right treating him as a martyr who was literally silenced in a courtroom for trying to defend himself. The truth, as usual, is more complicated than either narrative allows. Trump did violate court orders. That's not really in dispute based on the evidence the judge presented. Trump did refuse to comply with direct instructions from the bench to remain silent during a hearing where his lawyers were perfectly capable of making arguments on his behalf. The judge did have legal authority to remove him for contempt and disruption, but it's also true that the judge was making decisions that had enormous political implications, that the gag order itself is open to debate in terms of how broadly it's written and how much it restricts political speech, and that the entire situation occurs in a context where Trump genuinely is facing an unprecedented level of legal scrutiny that no other president or former president has faced. Both things can be true simultaneously. Trump can be receiving legitimate accountability for actual violations of law, while also being targeted more aggressively because of who he is and because of the political threat he represents. The danger is that we're losing the ability to hold both of those ideas at once, to acknowledge that this is complicated and that there are legitimate concerns on multiple sides. Instead, everyone retreats to their corners, everyone interprets every new development as confirmation of what they already believed, and we drift further into a world where there's no shared reality, no common understanding of what's happening, no possibility of agreement on even basic facts because everything is filtered through partisan lenses that make compromise and mutual understanding impossible. This courtroom incident will be remembered completely differently by different segments of the population. Trump's supporters will remember it as the day a corrupt judge physically silenced their champion. Trump's opponents will remember it as the day a delusional narcissist finally faced consequences for treating the legal system with contempt, and those memories will shape how people vote, how they understand American democracy, how they judge institutions, in ways that we probably can't fully predict right now, but that will matter enormously. So here's the bottom line, and this is what everyone needs to understand, regardless of where you stand politically or what you think about Trump personally. What happened in that federal courtroom represents a breaking point in the relationship between political power and institutional authority in America. A former president, someone who held the highest office in the land and who might hold it again, was physically removed from a courtroom for refusing to comply with a judge's direct orders. That's not normal. That's not something that happens in functioning democracies with strong rule of law. That's something that happens when the basic assumptions that allow institutions to function break down. You can argue about who's at fault. You can argue about whether Trump's behavior justified the judge's response or whether the judge overreached. But what you can't argue is that this is sustainable. We cannot have a system where major political figures simply refuse to accept institutional authority and where institutions have no effective tools to enforce compliance without turning every legal proceeding into a political circus that undermines their own legitimacy. What happens next matters more than what happened yesterday, because we're at a point where the trajectory could go in multiple directions. If Trump continues down this path, and if he faces real consequences, meaningful consequences that actually limit his behavior and that demonstrate that rule of law still means something, then maybe the system holds. Maybe we pull back from the brink. Maybe we reestablish some baseline norms about institutional respect. If Trump continues down this path and doesn't face real consequences, if he's able to violate court orders and disrupt proceedings and ultimately escape accountability because his political support makes enforcement too costly, then the precedent being set is absolutely catastrophic for American democracy. It means that anyone with enough political backing can place themselves above the law, can refuse to comply with institutional authority, can treat courts and Congress and oversight bodies as obstacles to be defied, rather than as legitimate parts of our constitutional system. And if that becomes the new normal, if that's the world we're heading into, then we need to be honest about what that means for the future of American democracy and for the question of whether we still have a system of laws or just a system of power. This story is far from over. This is just one hearing in one case in what will be years of legal battles and political warfare. Keep your eyes on how Trump's legal team responds to the appeals process. Keep your eyes on how other judges in other cases adjust their approach based on what happened here. Keep your eyes on how Republican voters react as this incident gets processed through the news cycle and the campaign trail. Keep your eyes on whether Trump moderates his behavior at all or whether he doubles down and treats the next court appearance as another opportunity to confront judicial authority. Keep your eyes on whether Congress responds with any legislative action to clarify the limits of contempt power or gag orders or any of the other legal questions that this incident raises. Keep your eyes on international reactions and on whether America's adversaries and allies adjust their calculations based on the perception that American institutions are weakening and that American political stability can no longer be taken for granted. This moment, this image of a former president being escorted out of a courtroom by security, will be in history books, and what chapter it ends up in, whether it's the chapter about accountability finally being enforced or the chapter about democratic institutions collapsing under the weight of political polarization, depends entirely on what happens next. This could define the next decade of American politics and American constitutional order, and we're all watching it unfold in real time right now. O Claude Podot 2. Cometer erros, confira sempre as respostas.